Earlier, while comparing the genome to a book, I mentioned that we could read the genome. This is to say that we can interpret the genome. Over the years, different techniques used to do this have developed as technology has improved. To demonstrate the progress of these technologies, I will begin at a time when genetic knowledge was very basic. When the famous Austrian monk Gregor Mendel was experimenting with pea plants, the idea of nucleotides or chromosomes had not yet been realized. Mendel observed traits that had a predictable pattern of inheritance through pea plant. He observed that certain traits consistently through the generations seemed to be influenced by pairs of factors. To illustrate this, I'm going to take two simple traits like height and color. I'm going to represent tallness with T and smallness with little t, redness with a big R, and whiteness with a small r. These are examples of factors, and the factors that are bound by the same characteristic oppose one another's functions. The big T will give rise to a tall pea plant, whereas the small t will give rise to a small pea plant. The big R will give rise to a red pea plant, and the small one will give rise to a white pea plant. Factors that control the same characteristic cannot be inherited together, but factors that control different characteristics can be inherited together through generations. The way that genes that control different traits can be inherited together, and the way that the genes that control the same traits cannot be inherited together, is attributed to chromosomes. We see here that the genes controlling height and the genes controlling color are located at the same position of two copies of the same chromosome. I mentioned earlier that different forms of the same gene can oppose one another's functions. When this happens, one of the two gene forms can be dominant over the other. This is to say that one of the gene's instructions will be expressed over the others. This is usually signified by a stronger capital and a weaker lowercase letter. Hence, for example, despite the fact that this individual carries the smallness gene, its effects will be dominated by the tallness gene, and this will result in a tall individual. The same is clear for the color controlling proteins. Here we see that the redness gene is dominant to the whiteness gene, and the redness gene will be expressed over the whiteness gene. We see also that the T and the R gene are located on the same chromosome, and this means that they will be inherited together through the generations. Genes that are located on the same chromosome are said to be linked, and again, this means that they will be inherited together. We will see later how this is an important concept in genetics. When mating occurs, pairs of chromosome copies split into what are known as gametes. We will discuss later how this process occurs, but for now, the most important concept to be aware of is that gametes are what define which genes are inherited together. Sometimes a big T and a small r will be inherited together through the generations. This would result in a tall red plant, while other times a big T and a small r could be inherited together through generations, and this would result in a tall white plant. Other times a small t and a big R could be inherited together, which would result in a small red plant, and a small t and a small r would result in a small white plant. To account for all of the possible combinations of gametes that could arise when predicting inheritance patterns, Mendel would use what was known as a Punnett square. We see that different gametes could fuse in different combinations. Again, we see that the big R dominates the small r to give rise to a red plant, while the big T dominates the small t to give rise to a tall plant. The only way for genes that are not dominant to be expressed is for two non-dominant genes to be combined. And so, when Mendel crossed two pea plants with this particular set of factors, the distribution of factors in the offspring would always be of a predictable ratio, such as 9:3:3:1. There are 9 tall and red plants, 3 tall and white plants, 3 small and red plants, and 1 small and white plant. In modern genetics, Mendel's so-called factors that influence traits are now commonly referred to as genes.